Thank you for having me. Thank you for the introduction. I appreciate it. I'm going to speak to some PowerPoint slides. I like to talk to pictures. It's the easiest way for me to express myself and my thoughts and my interpretation of things. I do want to start off by clarifying that the introduction is absolutely correct. I work in the Bureau of Revenue Estimates. I am appointed by the governor through the budget secretary, by the legislature through the treasurer, and by the comptroller himself, with the idea in Maryland of keeping the politics 100% completely separate from the finances and the economics. It's something that the rating agencies praise us for. It's something we're very proud of, and it is in fact true. There is no politics in Maryland's budget. This serves great purpose because I may say some things that my bosses, the three of them, may not completely agree with. So please don't hold them in contempt for anything that I say here. These are my thoughts alone. Start with some national data and then drill down to the Maryland outlook. And when I start here, this is each of the post-World War II recessions and subsequent expansions indexed to their prior peak. So everybody starts at 0, and then you can see the number of quarters going out and the pace of growth. The hashed line is this expansion, so post the Great Recession. Mr. Barkin and I were speaking briefly before the meeting, and he works in consultation with Virginia's revenue estimates. He asked me how we were doing. We're doing quite well. We're hitting our estimate. The problem is we're growing at that pace. And anyone that pays attention to Annapolis will know that we have persistent budget deficits. And that's because our spending patterns were built on those other lines that were growing at a much greater clip, whereas we've been humbled at about half that pace of growth. So we've spent quite a bit of time trying to determine what's going on. And of course, we use history to predict the future. We're in unprecedented territory here. It took us quite a bit of time to catch up to what was going on, to take our models and say, that's great, but we probably need to go with about half of that. It's the reality of the situation. Why are we growing so slowly? We believe it to be a function of the labor force and a maturing of the productivity cycle. This is a very noisy chart, okay, and I won't hold you to this. What you have there are the blue bars of the GDP, as was mentioned earlier. It's all about, on the supply side, the number of employees and how productive those employees are. We've seen a lag in the amount of productivity. That's the green line there, growing quite slowly. This is the maturing of the technology revolution, right? We've all incorporated technology to grab the greatest productivity fruit from it that we could to this point. That makes a lot of sense. But I think there's something else going on in this chart. And I believe this is very important. I believe this gives me a lot of midterm optimism. And that is, if you look back to the 1970s, where productivity also began to lag for a period of time. That is the period when the baby boomers entered the workforce en masse. We're going through that now. We've been absorbing the millennials throughout this entire expansion. So what you have is this grand entrance of this huge new entrance to the labor force, which is fantastic. The more workers, the better the economy. But as we all know, and all of you know as business leaders, when you bring new employees in, they might actually reduce your productivity initially. You now have to mentor them. You have to focus them. You have to teach them. They've got these amazing educations. The millennials are the most highly trained generation in the history of this country. And that's brilliant, but it's going to take a little while for it to pay dividends. We're investing in them now. As you can see, similar to the baby boomers there, that little bit of a lag, and then we take off. It's not unreasonable to assume that we could see something like that in this country in the midterm. So that does give me some midterm optimism. There's not much we can do about the labor force. We can, of course, focus on education and better preparing folks for that labor force, but the reality is just the number of individuals available is growing at a very slow pace. So really the key to unlocking a boost in economic growth is productivity. Pivoting to Maryland and where we stand compared to those national figures, here's another indexing of the same factor, but with Maryland in red. You can see that Maryland, as per usual, did not fall as far during the Great Recession as the nation as a whole. This is typical. Buoyed by the federal government, we never rise as fast, we never fall as hard, okay? But what you do see is while we didn't have as significant of a recession, we did fall into a period of a recession of our own from 2011 all the way through early 2014. They don't call state recessions, it's not something that's done, but this coincides with the federal budget sequestration. As soon as Congress began to even discuss sequestration, the private sector began to react, and we saw a reduction in investment and jobs in late 2011. And then when the federal government actually made the budget cuts, we saw a slowdown on the federal side. So we were in a great period of at least flat growth, if not receding growth, for quite some time, while the nation itself was really beginning to climb out of the recession at a great pace. We catch back up, we're in sync, and then more recently, we are fumbling a bit relative to the nation as a whole. At the state level, we focus on the two most critical factors for the state's budget, employment and wage growth. That drives the state's budget process. So again, a bit of a noisy chart here, but this is to show the region compared to the nation. This is employment growth year over year through the first quarter of 2019. And the blue bar is the United States. There in the green is Virginia, who has done a bit better. This administration in DC has been more focused on military spending, especially hardware, which more directly benefits Virginia. And then we've got Maryland, DC lagging somewhat significantly. Of course, this relates to federal employment. Again, same chart, same characters in play here. And you can see both Maryland and DC lagging somewhat. If you add up the number of jobs between Maryland and DC that have been lost from their peak in the federal employment, that's 7,500 jobs. The average federal government paycheck in Maryland is $105,000. So the fact that we're contracting in federal employment has significant ramifications for the economy and directly for the state's budget. We look at it through withholding. I benefit from having some of the best wage data available to me at a real time. All of you, when you get your paycheck, obviously we're withholding a share of that. It's going to the state of Maryland. So in real time, I have a pretty good feeling for the pace of wage growth, assuming that I understand employment. And what you can see here is a combination of non-federal employment and federal employment, a moving average to smooth things out. But as you would expect based on those employment charts, the federal withholding is a drag on growth overall. All in all, the state's wage base is growing at about 4% a year right now. Aggregate wage growth, 4% a year. That's been pretty consistent for some time. The players contributing to that growth has been changing over that period. So while we're contracting on federal positions, the private sector seems to be benefiting to some degree. This is a national chart. This is not Maryland specific. It's a component of GDP, and it is what the federal government purchases from the private sector. So again, you can see that contraction throughout the period of sequestration as the federal government was cutting expenditures, but more recently, a surge to better than 10% year-over-year growth. So while we are seeing the federal positions directly contracting, I think we're seeing them picked up to some degree with outsourcing, especially of employment through the public or the private sector, providing the types of jobs that direct federal employees used to do in many cases. Here's the number that matters the most for me. This is average wage growth. All right, this goes all the way back to 1949. It's year over year, recessions are shaded, and what you can see is that throughout this entire expansion, we've been averaging slightly better than 2%. So with inflation running more recently closer to 2%, we're not really getting a lot of real wage growth in the state of Maryland. Just as employment has lagged in the state, so has our amount of wage growth. We've not quite seen the strength in wage growth that the nation as a whole has seen. So we've been spending a lot of time trying to determine what's happening here. The job mix has not been favorable. This is 2018 employment in Maryland. It's ranked by sort of what I call the growth factor. So you take the amount of growth in the industry, that's column A, the little a. You look at B, that's the share of that industry and its total employment. Multiply those two together and you get kind of its real contribution, so you can rank the industries. So education and health services, 16.6%, grew 2.1%. On the far right, we've got the average wage of that industry during that period in time. So some very strong growth there at the top, all excellent things to see. The issue is down at the bottom, where you see the three contracting industries: information services, federal government, and financial activities. All the top three paying industries in the state of Maryland. Okay? Our three highest paid industries contracted in 2018. That's, of course, going to affect our wage growth. Here's the first quarter of 2019, the most recent data available, and a similar picture. Those same three industries down there at the bottom. The average wages are higher. A lot of bonuses are paid out in Q1, so that's pretty normal to see. But all three contracting there as well. The good news is it does appear that federal government employment is possibly stabilizing. Perhaps we're no longer going to see as much of a contraction, but it's only one quarter, so I don't want to get too excited just yet. And to be clear, it's not like they're terminating employees down there in DC. They're just not refilling positions. So some of this could be dictated really by the decisions of the federal employees and really related to when they decide to retire or move on to other employment. There's the age factor. We've all heard about this to some degree. Here we have, over time, the population in the state of Maryland, as well as a forecast from Moody's Analytics. And what you can see there is that yellow bar swelling, the over 65, right? We're all aware of this. This is affecting everything from consumption, I believe, to business investment. And it shows up specifically in retirements. There is no data that I have access to that really focuses on those retiring from the labor force. This is a labor force figure. It is those that are employed that have decided to leave the labor force. So it's probably the closest we can get to really gauging if the number of retirees is changing. Obviously, there's a dip down during the recession, but if you compare where we are today to back to the mid-2000s, a sort of normal economic expansion period, we are 0.3% higher at this point on average. That relates to 420,000 individuals, okay? Why is that important? As we showed in that first chart, productivity. Our more seasoned employees, you're most productive in the ages between 45 and 64, and that makes sense. You have experience, you've found the right job, you're hitting on all cylinders, you're generating income for your company, for yourself, things are going right. As you start to shift into that category and you start to retire, we lose that experience and we backfill that with lesser experienced individuals. That is reducing productivity and it is impacting wages directly as well. This is an extreme example. All right, this is a retirement churn example with a small firm, 50 entry-level employees, middle management, vice president, president. Assuming the president moves on, assuming the president was at the upper bound and each person is promoted up the chain, going from an upper bound to a lower bound, right? As you move into that new position, you don't have that experience. You start at a lower wage. In that scenario, again, an extreme scenario, the firm has stabilized employment, but aggregate wages have gone down 6.1%, okay? So simply the churn of the baby boomers' retirement and then the backfilling throughout the pipeline is putting a downward pressure directly on wages. So wages make up 90% of the income tax in the state of Maryland, okay? 90% of the income tax. The income tax is 50% of the general fund budget. That's why we care so much about wages. We've got a pretty good handle on wage growth. Our outlook is for employment to grow about 50 basis points a year from here through the horizon. Most recently, we reduced our outlook for average wage growth. We had been expecting about 3% in 2019. We've now reduced that to 2.5, and we also have that on the horizon. That is somewhat of a strategic move, okay? Our models tell us we're going to get to 3%. They've been telling us that for several years. We're now taking the position that we're going to make the economy push us off of that number. Let's be wrong and be underneath and finally get pushed up on the wage growth. So we don't forecast recessions. If we were to forecast a recession and cut the state's budget by 4% and be wrong, we would be cutting services and we would be cutting state employment immediately, and we'd be wrong, okay? So what we do is we offer caution. We know that we are in a mature economic expansion. There's nothing wrong with 2% GDP growth. If you watch TV, you'd think the world, the sky is falling. There's nothing wrong with 2% GDP growth. It's about where we should be. You can't ignore some of the signals that were mentioned earlier. Okay, we're watching those signals, and we're urging a degree of caution for the state. Whenever we have a budget surplus, which happens in the upswings in the economy, we never quite catch up with the upswings. We have extra money at the end of the year. We're cautioning to put that into the rainy day fund and save that should there be a subsequent downswing. So that really hits the employment. I think there's some positives out there. The federal budget sequestration that I just spoke about and has been hampering Maryland's economy expires at the end of 2021. That will be a great benefit to the state of Maryland, a great benefit to the state of Maryland. And I think in the state, we're finally building some momentum behind workforce development. The last several sessions, there has been quite a bit of dollars dedicated to workforce development. This is the area where I believe we should be focusing investment in a very meaningful way. I'd be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity with this group to push some policy that we stand behind in the Bureau of Revenue Estimates. We have taken our tax data and broken it into age cohorts and created what we call the taxpayer participation rate. So we take, let's say, a joint return, my wife and I, and we split us into individuals. We share the income equally, and we look at us as individuals. Then we look at that relative to the population. And the idea is, what share of our population is showing up on tax returns? Nobody likes to pay taxes, right? But it does symbolize a connection to your community and to society as a whole, right? It's something we all just have to do. What you can see here is an indexing of the age cohorts back to 2007, which was a peak, okay? But then what you see is the number of individuals that are missing, okay? And throughout this entire expansion, it's been an extraordinary amount. And what you also see is that the purple and the tealish there, the two at the top of each of the bars, have grown significantly. These are the 45 to 64. These are those individuals that, we've been reading about ever since the last presidential election. Age discrimination is a very real thing. These are the folks that have been left behind in the economy. We look at it in the data. They're trying, they're in and out. In 2010, they're in the tax data. In 2011, they're gone, okay? They make about $20,000, $25,000 a year, all right? Not really enough to sustain a family. That's 110,000 individuals altogether, okay? The number in the 45 to 65 cohort is about 65,000, all right? To put that in context, that fills Ravens Stadium. That many people, all right, are trying and can't quite make it. There's still another 15% of people that aren't even trying, okay? So the bottom line is, while I've talked a bit about the labor force and how that is going to restrain growth, they're sitting there waiting for us to invest in them, okay? It's not just perhaps children we should be investing in education-wise, it's their parents. There's all kinds of studies, all kinds of empirical research that points to investments in the home life improving the outcomes of the children. This is not something that we should be neglecting. It's an opportunity staring us right in the face, and I hope that the state of Maryland continues to look at increasing its investment in a very meaningful way in workforce development for adults. And on that, thank you very much.